Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to wyomingpbs.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
Main Street, Wyoming is made possible by Kennecott Energy Company, proud to be a part of Wyoming's future in the coal and uranium industries, which includes exploration, mining, and production. And the Wyoming Council for the Humanities, enriching lives of Wyoming people through the study of Wyoming history, values, and ideas.
Western writers used to say, nobody understands our work and appreciates it because they don't know our life. And they say, who would be interested in ewes giving birth to lambs, for example? And yet it is a unique way of life, and maybe we're becoming more aware of what it offers that is valuable.
In 1995, Governor Jim Geringer appointed Wyoming's third poet laureate, Robert Roripaugh. Join us on Main Street, Wyoming to meet this novelist, poet, and teacher whose family ranched in the Wind Rivers and whose words speak for all of us who know and love Wyoming. Welcome to Main Street, Wyoming. I'm Deborah Hammonds, and my guest today is Robert Roripaugh. Bob will be showing us the ranch where his family lived outside of Lander and sharing those stories which helped lead to his being named our state's Poet Laureate. Bob, you've had a distinguished career as a writer and as a professor at the University of Wyoming, but this is where your life in Wyoming really started?
This essentially is it, and this is where my parents bought a ranch. My father was an engineer, my mother had been a school teacher, but mostly a mother, raising my brother and me. And they came up to Wyoming and looked at ranches, and this is the one that they decided to buy. And they both came here and bought this ranch about the time that we had the big blizzard in 48 and 49. So that
that's a historic. Were you here for that?
No. They were here. I was here just before it. I'd gone back to school, and I just heard about the results of it.
Well, how many people were there in your family? Your mother, your father, yourself, and
I had an older brother at that point, who's about 3 years older, and he was off in college, and I had started college. And as soon as my parents bought the ranch, that's where I began to spend my summers. And when I became a student, transferred to the University of Wyoming, which is about 1950, then I began to come back here as much as I could and worked on it in the summers and holidays and what have you, and spent as much time here as I could.
Now, I know you've written very eloquently in essays about what ranching life was like back then, but you as a young man, what were you involved in?
Well, I was involved in a number of different kinds of things.
Okay, just the ones that we can have on this show.
Okay. I, of course, was going to college. I was under the watchful eye of my draft board, so I knew that I was going into the service fairly soon, which was common in the early 1950s. The Korean War had started. I became involved in writing while I was at the University of Wyoming, and I began by starting to write fiction, and I began to study with a poet named Joseph Langland, who helped me a great deal with my fiction, and I don't know whether he thought I was going to amount to much as a poet or not, so I may have surprised him at that point somewhere along the line.
So there you are writing, majoring in English at the University of Wyoming, but meanwhile in your summers and when you're home with your family, you're a cowhand, you're a sheep person. What all were you doing here?
A fence builder. A lot of the fence that we're looking at here, I and my father worked on, and we did build a lot of fence because it was always in need of repair. And I worked a lot in the hayfields, usually mowing and buck raking and stacking from time to time. I enjoyed working with horses, and we usually had 3, 4, sometimes a few more horses around the place. I had a friend named Johnny Prideaux, who was also interested in rodeo and horse breaking. And we worked for a time out on the Sweetwater for a rancher named William Scarlett, breaking horses out on the Sweetwater, which I much enjoy because I'm very fond of that part of the country. And in the course of this, I became involved in college rodeo for a time. And this was a very interesting sort of experience on the whole, but it tied in with my beginning to write and the kind of fiction I was beginning to write, because one of my subjects early on turned out to be rodeo. And so that more or less tied together to a degree.
Now, as I look at this and I think of your life with horses and all of that, there was a really important person in everyone's life, and that was the person who shoed the horses. You have a beautiful poem about that. Could you share that with me?
Sure, I would be glad to. And the horse shoeing would take place down in the corrals or just outside the corral area. And the horses usually had to be shod in the spring. And that was always an interesting event, and one that we watched with some interest, perhaps in part because we were concerned on how it would all come out and which horse would misbehave and whether they would all get shod or not. This is the old horse shoer. It's about this time of year. The old horse shoer. In late spring, the horse shoer navigates our soggy road, his Studebaker truck clanging an anvil, tools of the trade, iron shoes in a barrel. Stooped, day's work mixed with mustache, he sets up under cottonwoods, keeping one eye on the corral where Sugar, Pee-wee, wary Shorty are waiting. Their coats are patchy, winter hair shedding unevenly. Belly's a little gant. He hasn't come for small talk, remembering the last time he picks out Shorty first, ties him high by a heavy halter rope. Wearing leather apron with pouches for nails, the old man lifts a foot, swears, wheels his curved hoof knife, spits, neatly clips the edge with rusty pinchers, rasps it level. He bends the caulk shoe by a squint, pounds, fits, refits, gauging the ellipses against soft blue and Shorty's cautious eye. His mouth bristling with nails, he works under the raised front leg, a circus act, gray cap on backwards, hammers near the quick, twisting and clinching nails down, mutters to himself, the light green morning opening to sun. Shod in muddy boots, he limps around Shorty, picks up one hind foot, easily as a tired lover, asks if we've heard the first meadowlark.
Oh, now a bird is supposed to sing on cue. That's
right. And it's just about time, but the snow may be a little daunting for them. But that was always nice, too. It's one of the sounds, and red-ringed blackbirds that were down by the river was another nice sound.
Bob, that was wonderful. Now, what I want to do is let's go in someplace warm and sit down, and I want to visit with you about your life as a poet and a writer in Wyoming, and you can share some more poems with us.
Okay, that sounds fine.
Bob, we did a show on Owen Wister, and my guests were talking about if you were to read just one novel about the American West, they said the book that they would recommend would be Robert Roripaugh's Honor Thy Father, which I know it won the Western Heritage Award as the Outstanding Western Novel in 1963. Can you tell me about the book?
Well, I sometimes laughingly described to my classes the book as a novel that I wrote about Wyoming and ranching and the cowboy, and my intention, I said, was to correct all the faults that I'd found in the Virginian. I doubt that I've achieved that, and I'm not sure the Virginian has that many faults, but I was interested in doing materials that come out of a similar point in time. 1889 is the setting for the novel. It's set out on the Sweetwater River country that I like and know fairly well. And what I was interested in was seeing what I could do with a family ranching there. A father whose wife has died. He's raising 2 sons. There's about 3 years difference in age between those sons, and the sons are quite different in terms of temperament and attitude and the way people respond to them. So that was the basic situation that I had to start with. And then played against that is the background of 1889, which is about the time of the Johnson cattle war, the lynching of cattle, Kate Maxwell and Jim Averill, and all the problems that came out in that particular bad period of time in the Wyoming ranching industry. So the historical part came in through that.
Well, I know, I absolutely loved it. I found a copy in our county library, and I'm sure there are copies in every Wyoming county library. And what I found particularly good was I felt like you understood that world. You described it in a way as if you had lived during that period of time. I don't know how you were able to do that. Had you heard stories from people about what it was like, or?
At that particular point, I thought at least I knew ranchers fairly well, and I assumed that I understood something of what they would have been like in that earlier point in time. But I did know enough about ranching and cattle and horses and so forth to be able to make that part what I assumed would be reasonably authentic. And then I did an awful lot of research into the period, life of that particular point in time, the Wyoming Cattlemen's Association and the problems that they were having, and the incidents that surrounded that point in history in 1889. So there was a lot of background work that I had to do. But there were other things like Wyoming itself that I thought, a good grasp of, and some of those things pervade the novel: background, setting, what the country looks like.
Well, just to give my viewers a sense of it, can you read a little bit, a little cutting for us from it, so they can see the Wyoming that they know?
Sure. This is just a very short little piece of description from early on in the novel that shows Wyoming coming through. In March, the wind usually blew hard from the west, feeling like it was sharpened on the Wind River Mountains and the edge of Beaver Rim. The wind was what made the Sweetwater country good for cattle. Most winters it blew the snow off so that cows could live without any hay. And usually there would be a warm chinook when you needed it most. There was none in the worst months of '87, and the cattle drifted south toward Red Desert and starved until they ganned up, humpback and bony as sage roots, and piled into ravines or creek bottoms to die. But the March wind was laying today. I heard a meadowlark flute from across a far draw, and I was glad to be riding somewhere, listening to old Blackie snort, as he did whenever he wanted to jog trot, and smelling the rain so clean and sharp, like it always was at green-up time.
Although Bob has written 2 novels and numerous short stories, most of his time now is spent with his poetry. We asked how his poems come to him.
I think they sometimes come in different ways, but initially I think you have something that triggers a memory, or you see something or talk to someone and it reminds you of something that's happened to you in your past, and you think, well, that is interesting. That is, I think our lives are made up of certain high points as far as the more obvious events are concerned, but it's also made up of a lot of small things that become important to you. And those are the things that may make ultimately good poems. But you don't really know until you've worked with the idea. So you have an image, you have a memory, you have a sense of something that's happened that you think might be interesting to, certainly to yourself and more importantly to other people, and then you begin to work with it, try to get something down on the page, tinker with that, change it, and hope that ultimately you get a poem to come out from that. This poem that I'm going to read is one that is about rodeo and how we feel about it, and the fashion in which most Wyoming communities respond to it, at least. I think this is true everywhere. As in Lander, the rodeo is on the 4th, so it's called the rodeo on the 4th. I feel it haying on hotter afternoons, the way that sun hangs there forever, while downtown streets brighten, bloom into flags and pennants, beer cans, and the air at night promises another go-round, with excitement, girls, old widowmaker. The carnival arrives, a dirty canvas mood I recognize, and Arapahoes dance for tourists who pitch them silver spinning through the neon. A cowgirl picking from a truck bed cries her last cruel love away. Bars fill with hope and booze, women beautiful as Wrangler ads. Our neighbor packs off to the mountains fishing. Bud's nerves go bad on parades and drunks. Asks me to come, but I'm already there with the Coors, dreaming of softer skin, better days coming back like bison. On the 4th of July, I might get lucky riding barebacks, take day money, and find her along the bar at the American Legion Club. Bareback bronc riding was the event that I competed in mainly, and when I finished college, I was drafted into the Army, and I had to give up that facet of my interests. When I came back for the Army, which was 2 years later, I rode in one more show at Laramie with the rodeo club. I was a student again, and that was more or less the finish of that short career.
And the launching of your mining those experiences for your poetry. And
yes.
Your writing, you know, you write so beautifully about horses and honor thy father. It's obvious. I mean, in that it's not a sport; it's a way of life. That's one of the things that you have in there is the disagreement about how do you break a horse.
Yes. That particular kind of argument is one that certainly at that point in time went on in terms of how people wanted to break their animals and the way that they would approach it. But that was the sort of thing that adds information that is useful to someone who wants to be a writer. And one of the things that I would tell my students is that their problem isn't just writing, their problem also is in developing the materials that they're going to use as writers, and also in that the materials that are most useful to them aren't necessarily the most unusual, unique, exotic things that they could think of, but were more apt to be ordinary kinds of things that almost anyone might go through, but that they would think about in more sensitive and interesting ways. There aren't that many completely new things to write about, but there are a lot of things that can be written about well if the person approaches it from that vein. So it doesn't have to be unusual material.
You've worked with hundreds of students through your years in teaching in different workshops. What do you think it takes to be a successful writer?
I think it's a mix-up of several qualities that they can bring, and they may bring different qualities. One of the things that goes into teaching students of creative writing is trying to decide where that student is in his work or her work, and also maybe what the student most needs. A student, for example, may most need some kind of confidence, or a student may be too overconfident and unwilling to revise his work, because most work is revised very extensively. Just for example, the poem that I was just reading is pretty short, but if I went back and looked at the drafts that I'd done, I'd probably have 20 drafts that it went through at least before it came to the shape that it had now.
Time-wise, would you say how long would it take you to write it? What you can consider a finished poem?
Probably several months, at least. And that would be pretty typical of the way things go, and I would simply hold on to it until it did seem to satisfy me, and then I would send it out and see whether periodicals were interested in it, and I might then go back and revise it some more. And even after a piece is published in poetry, one might choose to revise it more, which is not true of my attitude toward a novel, for example, or necessarily toward a short story that's been published.
Now, I know that as you were describing what the qualities that a person would need to be a writer, you're talking about that ability to work, right. Some of the natural abilities.
Right. And I think there's a need for the imagination of the student to be fairly strong, at least in creative work, poetry or fiction. There needs to be that interest in things not necessarily as they literally are, although that's often a beginning point, but what things might become, what might happen if such and such happened, what might happen if some elements of reality were changed in certain ways to bring about a different sort of result. And I think one does need to have a fairly strong imagination. I think you need to have a good memory. If you can't remember things that have happened to you, then you're not liable to be able to pull those well into your writing. And one thing that your memory does is sift out things that may be important to you from things that aren't. That is, you simply lose track of some of those that are less significant and that you can't make use of. This poem came out of an experience over south of Saratoga, where along the Platte River there was a yellow willow tree that impressed me very much. I went there with my wife and my daughter many years ago. And this is a poem for my wife, Yoshiko. It's called Yellow Willow. October is a time of yellow willow, after green of aspen turns away. We must wait through cooler days when alders harden into red or brown, falling toward eons as willows yellow Wyoming foothills. I think your fingers have the shape of willow like your eyes. Perhaps it's just the slowness of the way you turn in quiet fire still, or something yellow as the leaf that holds to green skin darkening into brown and gray. Above Brush Creek, watching willow burn, I return to days in yellow matted rooms, the rainy season mist, yellow blossoms never touched by yellow. I could tell you all of this and more. I won't. My eyes are filled with fall and willows slow to yellow. So this was a poem that came out of an incident that was fairly concrete as an image, and it started from there. But what is behind that probably is the emotion of the particular stage of life I was in at that point, and how that could connect up with the scene that I was seeing. And willows are slow to turn, so they last longer into the fall, and that led into maybe the material content being transformed into a theme of some sort.
Bob, that poem is from your book, Learn to Love the Haze, and I understand that's going to be reissued. But I'm afraid we're about out of time, and I'd like you to conclude with one last poem for us.
Sure. I think I know the one that you want.
And this is going to be from your new collection called The Ranch?
Yes, I think the collection will probably be called The Ranch. And this is a poem that I worked over quite a bit at different points. It's called Sleeping Out on Sulphur Creek in Autumn, for John R. Milton. John Milton was a poet and an editor and a writer in South Dakota. He taught at the University of South Dakota and edited the South Dakota Review. And he died a little over a year ago. But it's about a lot of other things that relate to thinking about life and death. Sleeping Out on Sulphur Creek in Autumn. West of Coyote Lake, the sun meets granite hills. Light sharpens over snakeweed and sagebrush in the flats. Cattle wandering off the water lazily inspect my Jeep, bedroll in a grassy draw. Behind Mitten Spring, the rock turns red. After 30 years, a weathered hump familiar as my aging hand. All afternoon I've hiked alone through grama grass and sage. Sheep summered here, the herders trailing them home to the Sweetwater, his lead ewe black, drifting north ahead of fall. Now Benny Iturian's out of sheep, running cows and calves. I remember his house on Alkali, bringing him apples from our orchard. The way flocks of sage grouse strutted up from the water, headed for feeding grounds in morning light, and the sign he made for his front door. Welcome, hunters, make yourself at home, and please close gates. I hope he's well, friendly as ever, gates stretched tight. All things seem possible here on Sulphur Creek. The lone hawk hunts, a sagebrush drops, rising empty-handed. Do older eyes see more loss, or does the mind, like evening sun, heighten memory before it's all we are? What matters, I hear you say, is how lost family, friends, the solitary hawk, remain in remembered lives, images, words we share. Tonight, in a higher sky, the stars will be hard. Already horned larks are still. Quiet has fallen down in shadows. The last heavy truck from a drilling rig spreads dust along the road to Picket Lake. Sage grouse have moved up brushy draws to roost, and eagles silently make their final sweep along the flats. It should be easy to sleep. An early snow kept hunters home, though now it's melted, except for patches on Beaver Rim. One old antelope buck watched me at sundown from a distant ridge, then went to water below the spring. Drilling rigs are too far away to hear, and with a moon, coyotes will be calling if I wake up.
Robert Roripaugh, Wyoming's Poet Laureate. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For a copy of this or any Main Street Wyoming, send a check or money order to Wyoming Public Television or call us at 1-800-495-9788. Please include the subject or broadcast date of the program. The cost of each VHS tape is $20. We accept Visa, MasterCard, and Discover.
Main Street Wyoming is made possible by Kennecott Energy Company, proud to be a part of Wyoming's future in the coal and uranium industries, which includes exploration, mining, and production. And the Wyoming Council for the Humanities, enriching lives of Wyoming people through the study of Wyoming history, values, and ideas.